founders being this very religious group of people who, like you just mentioned, founded this country with very good intentions, trying to raise it up as the city on a hill, an example for all the world to follow. And there's that question of the religiosity. But, you know, we have very good evidence that our first president, George Washington, for example, was a Freemason. Thomas Jefferson had a copy of the Bible in which he removed every single word of God. He mentioned he was a deist. John Adams was a Unitarian. You being a traditional Catholic, I'm sure you would very much disagree with someone who denies the Trinity. The mention of that comment before about how in God we trust is in our coinage, right? This wasn't added until 1950 in order to contextualize that we were in the middle of the Cold War.
The motto predates it, but it wasn't added.
Yeah, it predates it because it was coming from the Civil War. But that was basically to separate us from the very atheistic Soviet Union. I'm definitely very much in the middle, but I don't think that the libs, as many call them, are wrong to just kind of identify that, hey, maybe we need to identify a more clear picture of the founding. If we're going to talk about how great Thomas Jefferson was and how he wrote these very illustrious and noble words, let's also include the fact that he owned these slaves. Let's also include the fact that he was a very hypocritical man. These were men, not gods. They were flawed. And I don't think that it's a crazy idea just to point that out and just to establish that. That's where I'm coming from. But I'd like to know your thoughts on it.
Your first point was better than your second point, but they're all very good, and you obviously know what you're talking about. Ironically, I think you're making a more conservative point, and I might be making a more progressive point, which is namely, I don't think that we need to return to the founding. I'm not saying we need to get in a time machine and go back to 1776. I wouldn't like to do that. It's not possible to do that. You can never go backwards. I also, in response to all of your totally factual statements about the founders, I suppose my response would be, yeah, they weren't perfect. You know, we would have major disagreements over religion, though in the case of Thomas Jefferson, frankly, the man forgot more about religion than most people ever learn today. So this was also a group of extraordinarily educated people who did go a bit wrong on a number of questions. Absolutely, of course. I don't want to go back to that. They weren't perfect. The reason that I would refrain from harping constantly over all of their personal moral failings is because we all have them. You know, look, we live in a country right now that kills 800,000 babies a year. And I know there are people who support abortion. Future generations will look on that with horror in the same way that we look on the Aztecs at Tenochtitlan. I promise you that. And so I would like us to be given a little bit of grace as well. And the Founding Fathers had all sorts of moral trepidations about slavery. They wrote about them. This is not some psychobabble here. You can read it in their own words. And so they were men who were captive of their time, and they did the best they could. And in some cases, they made errors. That's true. I think it is more productive, though, to focus on the philosophical and political issues that they got wrong. Because as you point out, there are a lot of them. But then you point out the answer to that, I think accidentally, which is you say, for instance, in God we trust, was not added to our currency until the 20th century. The motto comes from the middle of the 19th century, but it was added to our currency later on. Yes, that's true. You know what I call that? Progress. I call that an improvement. And I think that...
Well, I'll push you on this, because you say they were products of their time. Completely understand. But with that way of thinking, we have this understanding that progressive modern ideology of human rights and fairness just came out of nowhere. Because there were people in that time who also disagreed. John Adams was a founding father that I very much respect, because out of principle, he never owned a slave. He believed it was wrong. So how can we say they were products of their time when people in that time were also criticizing the institution?
Well, because there were people in Massachusetts had less of an economic need, incentive, and capture even for slavery, where it just would then someone say in Virginia, like Thomas Jefferson. So there's even context between the states. You know, the colonies were quite different. We live in a more homogenized nation today. That was not the case. The Southern economy was largely dependent on slavery. It was practiced in the North, but just it wasn't as reliant. So they were men of their time. They were more conscious of the errors of their time than many of us are today of the errors of our time. You mentioned the notion of human rights, which is one that I think is a little bit fuzzy, because everyone always claims a human right to whatever it is exactly that he wants. But it comes from a good place, which is the notion of human rights comes from the notion of natural rights. And the notion of natural rights can sometimes get a little fuzzy too, but that comes from the notion of natural law, and natural law is pretty solid. And so where does that come from? That doesn't come from some lib hippie in the 20th century. That comes from the church. That comes from various serious thinkers of Western civilization. So I think that we can identify where people have gone wrong a little bit philosophically, or where they just made mistakes because they were imperfect men living and doing the best they can, and we can try to deal with our own battles. Just as I criticize conservatives for constantly wanting to dig up the corpse of Ronald Reagan and just repeat the same 5 lines over and over from the Gipper, I say, let the man die, you know, he did his part. He did his part, he was a good man, now we have to fight our battles too. I think the same thing of the Founding Fathers. When I refer to these great men of history and why we ought to look up to them, it is in part because we would not be here without them. And so it's an extension of filial piety. Just as you ought to go a little soft on your parents, even if they're acting like jerks sometimes, so too we ought to go a little soft on our country. Patriotism is one extension of filial piety. And we ought to go soft even on our political ancestors as well, because we are standing on the shoulders of those giants. Some of us think that we're flying, but we're not. And someday people are going to correct our errors as well. And we should hope for the same grace that we might afford to our forebears. Because otherwise, then we're just going to tear everybody down, and we're going to say our country was founded by the most rotten people on the stupidest ideas, and we're all a bunch of just bags of flesh of nothing but our own personal interest. And that's going to lead us to degradation, and no one's going to flourish from that at all. On that happy note, wonderful to be with all of you. Thank you so much for